The ash-gray sky over Chicago felt heavy enough to press down on my ribs when I stepped out of the church that morning. My dad's mahogany casket, polished so bright it reflected the winter sun, was being lifted toward the hearse by 6 men who had no idea I was watching from across the street. I stood behind a bare maple tree, my breath turning white in the freezing air, the gravel crunching under my boots as I shifted my weight. My hands were numb, not from the cold, but from the sting of knowing I wasn't supposed to be there. Not even 10 yards away, my brother Mark wrapped an arm around Jenna, while Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. They looked like the perfect grieving family. They looked complete. And I was the ghost, watching the burial of my own father from the sidewalk like a stranger. That morning, I had opened a text from Mark that still scorched the back of my skull. "Don't come to Dad's funeral. Family only. You're not welcome." The words had hit me like a slap, sharp and echoing, burning through my chest with every passing minute. Even now, watching the hearse doors close with a soft metallic click, I could almost hear the hollow quiet inside my car when I first read that message, the hum of the heater suddenly deafening against the silence of betrayal. I should have pushed through those doors. I should have demanded a place beside my father. But instead, I stood still, frozen in place, watching my own family walk past me without even a glance. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, born and raised in a quiet suburb outside Chicago, though work has kept me in Los Angeles for years now. People like to imagine success looks glamorous: a corner office, a tailored blazer, a calm voice that commands a room. But mine came the hard way, through the scent of antiseptic halls, the cold touch of steel tables, and the soft, trembling voices of families who needed someone to steady them in their darkest hour. I built a funeral service company from the ground up, one exhausted night after another, my hands smelling faintly of lilies and disinfectant long after I got home. And for a long time, I believed that grit alone would earn respect from my family. But respect was something I never quite managed to grasp in that house. Growing up, I was the one who set the table, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who carried the weight when Dad got sick, or when Patricia had one of her silent spells that settled over the house like fog. Mark was charming too, charming, the kind of kid who smiled crookedly and got away with anything. Dad saw the best in him, even when he didn't try. Jenna was delicate and artistic, always drifting somewhere prettier, somewhere easier. And then there was me, responsible, capable, invisible. When I left for business school at 24, I still remember how the house smelled of lemon furniture polish and how no one came to the door to say goodbye except my dad, who hugged me tighter than usual but said nothing about how hard the next few years would be. Everyone else barely looked up from their own distractions. It was the story of my life. The one who gave the most was the one noticed the least. Over the years, I became the person who showed up at the hospital at 3 a.m. when Dad's heart monitor beeped wildly and Patricia froze like a porcelain doll. I was the one who called lawyers, handled bills, and patched Mark through every time he failed another semester or racked up another debt. But they never talked about that part. They talked about how strange my line of work was, how morbid, how unbecoming for someone in the Carter family. Micro tensions lived in the quiet moments, the way Patricia's hand lingered on Mark's shoulder, a heartbeat longer than on mine, the way Jenna never asked about my work, but always asked for help with hers, the way Dad once referred to me as the practical one, as if that were a consolation prize. I learned to live around those moments, the way you learn to avoid the cold spot on the kitchen floor in winter. Step lightly, step quickly. Don't acknowledge the chill. But the chill stayed. Maybe I should have seen the funeral text coming. Maybe all those years of being sidelined had been leading to this. Still, the air inside my car that afternoon felt too still, as if even the world was waiting to see how far my family would push before something inside me snapped. I stared at the words on my phone, reread them until they blurred, and wondered not for the first time how a family could cut out the one person who'd held them together. What I didn't know then was that this message, this betrayal, was only the beginning. Because within 24 hours, every buried truth in our family would rise to the surface, loud, bright, and impossible to ignore. The backyard was humid that July afternoon, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and charcoal from the grill. I remember standing at the edge of the patio, my fingers sticky from the popsicle that had already melted halfway down the stick. Mark and Jenna were huddled close beside Dad as he set up the sprinkler, their laughs sharp and bright under the sunlight. When he called out, "All right, you two run through," he didn't look in my direction, not once. I stepped forward anyway, toes touching the warm concrete, but Patricia gently pressed her hand against my shoulder, her perfume powdery and too sweet in the heat. "Honey, let them go first," she murmured, her voice soft but firm, the kind of tone that doesn't invite questions. So I waited, feeling the cool stickiness drying against my palm, while the water arched over the lawn in a glittering curtain. When I finally ran toward it, the sprinkler sputtered, almost as if it knew I was coming. The water thinned to a few weak streams before shutting off entirely. Mark groaned, Jenna shouted something I couldn't quite make out, and Dad, still smiling at them, didn't notice me standing there in my wet sneakers, the sun catching the droplets on my arms as if trying to console me. "Maybe next time," Patricia said, adjusting her gold bracelet, her eyes already drifting toward the grill. That summer afternoon stayed with me, the warmth on my skin, the sting behind my eyes, the soft click of Patricia's jewelry as she walked away. Years later, I can still feel the weight of that moment, the smell of grass, the sound of laughter I wasn't part of, the quiet that settled over me like a second skin. And just like that, the memory pulls back, and I'm once again an adult sitting alone in my car outside the airport, the glow from the dashboard reflecting off the window as I think about how long that pattern had been there, long before the funeral text ever arrived. The truth is, the Carter family had been shaping me into the outsider long before anyone put it into words. There were small fractures I didn't recognize until much later, the subtle inflections in someone's voice, the polite distance when I tried to speak, the way affection always seemed to travel around me rather than toward me. The earliest years of my childhood were quiet ones. I learned quickly that silence made things easier. Dad worked long shifts at the warehouse, coming home with the scent of engine grease on his jacket, a faint tiredness in the way he lowered himself into his recliner. He loved us. I never doubted that, but Mark was the one who tugged at his sleeve for attention, and Jenna was the dreamer he doted on. I was the one who mirrored his practicality too closely, the one who didn't ask for much, because I already understood he didn't have much left to give. Patricia came into our lives when I was 10, carrying with her a cloud of lavender-scented hairspray, and a certain poised elegance that felt foreign in our plain house. She meant well, at least I like to think she did, but she gravitated toward Jenna's sweetness and Mark's charm. I, with my notebooks, my questions, my need to understand every little thing, seemed to overwhelm her. "Sweetheart, don't worry about it," she'd say when I'd ask why the budget didn't seem to match the bills. Her voice was warm, but her eyes flickered away each time, searching for a pleasant distraction. I learned to swallow my worries, tuck them beneath my tongue, and carry them like tiny stones in my pockets. School didn't offer much refuge either. The cafeteria smelled of reheated pizza and disinfectant, and I remember sitting at a corner table wiping dust from the orange vinyl seat with my sleeve. Jenna would pass by with her circle of friends, her laughter ringing like wind chimes, while Mark swaggered down the hall, already well-liked without trying. I didn't mind being alone most days. Still, the isolation carved something into me, something quiet and deep. At home, the favoritism wasn't loud or cruel. It was quieter than that. More insidious because of the subtlety. It lived in the extra pancake on Mark's plate, the way Dad's face lit up whenever Jenna walked into the room, the ease with which Patricia offered them affection, while giving me polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. I wasn't mistreated. I was simply overlooked. When I turned 16, Dad forgot my birthday, not because he didn't care, but because he'd worked a double shift and was bone tired. The house was dim that evening, the smell of leftover spaghetti hanging in the air. I remember setting the table for 3 while they talked about Jenna's art show and Mark's upcoming basketball tryouts. When I mentioned I had aced my chemistry exam, Patricia gave me a soft nod. "You've always been the dependable one," she said. That was it. That was the praise. Dependable, not bright, not hardworking, not impressive. Just dependable, like an old lamp you turn on, because it never flickers. I blew out my birthday candle alone in the kitchen, the wax smell faint as it curled into the air. By the time I reached adulthood, I had mastered the art of stepping aside. I paid my own bills. I didn't ask Dad for money. I didn't call home unless I had good news because I didn't want to be a burden. I learned to make myself small, folding my needs into tighter and tighter shapes, until they barely cast a shadow anymore. And when Dad's health declined, when I started handling his medications appointments, and eventually the bills, I eased into that role almost without thinking. Someone had to, and I had always been the one who filled the spaces others left empty. Even when I left for Los Angeles and began building my company, the distance didn't change the patterns. Phone calls from home were always about someone else's crisis. Mark's tuition shortfalls, Jenna's childcare issues, Patricia's credit card problems. "Emily, you're so good with numbers," she'd say, the same powdered lavender scent echoing in my memory. "Can you look at this for me?" I'd hear the clatter of dishes, the shifting of chairs as they talked in the background, and I'd find myself smiling into the receiver, pretending I didn't feel the familiar ache settle beneath my ribs. They needed me, just not in the way a family should need someone. Years of this created a strange kind of invisibility. I was present, essential even, but unacknowledged. A shadow filling in the gaps, smoothing the cracks so no one else had to see them. And I told myself it was enough. I told myself that love expressed quietly was still love. I told myself I didn't need to be thanked, included, or even recognized. But the truth is, repeated neglect becomes its own kind of damage, steady, silent, seeping into the bones, until you forget what it feels like to be seen. Looking back, the signs were always there. The lingering glances between Mark and Patricia during family decisions. The way my ideas were heard, but not absorbed unless someone else repeated them. The slight hesitation before they asked for help, followed by the immediate assumption that I would give it. I had become their safety net, not their sister. Their solution, not their equal. And when that funeral text finally arrived, cold, abrupt, final, it didn't carve a new wound. It simply tore open an old one that had been quietly growing for decades. What I didn't realize in that moment was that the message, that cruel dismissal, was about to unravel everything I thought I understood about my place in the family. Because the truth wasn't just buried in the past. It was waiting just ahead, ready to come to light, in a way none of us could ignore. The cursor blinked on my laptop screen, bright and impatient in the dark of my hotel room. I hadn't meant to open the financial archive, but my fingers moved on their own, sliding across the trackpad, until a folder I hadn't touched in months opened with a soft click. The glow from the screen lit up the room in harsh blue, reflecting off the glass of water on the nightstand. I clicked one file, then another, and another, the quiet taps of my fingertips sounding too loud in that stillness. A PDF loaded my father's hospital invoice from last year. The header read, "Primary payer, Morrison, Memorial Services." My breath hitched. Another file opened a receipt from Jenna's Children's Academy paid automatically by the same line. Then Mark's graduate loan payoff stamped paid in full. My company's routing number sitting at the bottom like a signature I suddenly didn't recognize. Then, Patricia's credit card balance thousands of dollars cleared in a single transfer. The archive kept going page after page, year after year, all of it stamped with my own corporate insignia. Every debt, every emergency, every crisis, all routed back to me. I stared at the glowing screen, the taste of copper rising in my throat, and understood with a kind of cold clarity that my family hadn't just leaned on me. They had built their lives on the ground beneath my feet, without ever acknowledging I was the one holding it steady. For a long moment, I didn't move. The hum of the hotel air conditioner filled the silence, a low, steady vibration that matched the trembling in my hands. It took only a few seconds for the shock to catch up with me, but when it did, it settled like a weight across my chest, heavy, unyielding, impossible to ignore. Looking back, the truth wasn't hidden. It was simply easier for me not to see it. The files told a story I had never meant to write. Every transaction was dated and tidy, the kind of record-keeping I prided myself on. I had always viewed those transfers as acts of love, quiet gestures, to keep the family afloat while Dad dealt with worsening health, and everyone else stumbled through their own complications. But seeing it now, laid out in clinical print, the numbers stacked like accusations, it felt different. It felt like proof. Proof that I had been the silent foundation beneath a house that never once acknowledged the ground it stood on. The deeper I dug, the clearer everything became. Each month of my father's care at the cardiology center, every procedure, every ambulance ride, every medication refill had been quietly billed to my company. Not one reimbursement from Dad's non-existent insurance ever appeared. The premiums had lapsed years ago. His pension couldn't cover a fraction of it. My mouth went dry as I opened Patricia's ledger. Department store charges, resort fees, boutique purchases. It was all there. Shopping sprees masked as household expenses. I scrolled down to the oldest entries and my stomach tightened when I realized I had been covering her debt since the month after Dad's first heart episode. She had known. She had to. Someone doesn't rack up thousands in spending and shrug off how easily it disappears unless they're used to someone else absorbing the blow. Then came the mortgage statements. The house I grew up in, the home that smelled of baked apples in fall and pine cleaner in winter, had nearly been foreclosed 2 years ago. I remembered that time, only vaguely a period when Dad had seemed quieter, more tired. I hadn't asked why, because he brushed me off, saying everything was under control. But the papers told a different story. The payments had stopped. The bank had prepared to seize the property. And then, out of nowhere, a lump sum appeared again from Morrison Memorial Services, clearing the debt in full and bringing the mortgage to zero. I had saved the house without knowing the house had needed saving. My eyes burned as I scrolled through more files. Mark's school loans, 4 separate accounts, each paid off as soon as the interest ballooned. Jenna's wedding, every vendor from the florist to the photographer had been routed through my corporate credit line. Her children's tuition auto payments from the same account year after year. None of them had paid a cent of those bills. None of them had even hesitated before sending the expenses along. And then, like a flicker of lightning, something else appeared. A timestamp from a hospital visit the month before Dad died. A note in the billing ledger. Family confirmed primary payer will remain MCC services. But I had never made that call. No one told me Dad had been hospitalized that month. No one mentioned the cost. They had simply assumed, once again, that I would cover it. Suddenly, the funeral text from Mark made a nauseating kind of sense. Family only. I wasn't family anymore because I had never been seen as family to begin with. I was a resource, a safety net, an automatic deposit masquerading as a sister. My fingers pressed against my forehead as I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the chemical sweetness of the cleaning spray housekeeping used earlier that day. I breathed slowly, trying to ground myself, but the air felt thin, the kind you can inhale without ever feeling full. How long had this been happening? I traced it back through the documents, month after month, year after year, until I reached the very first file. The date on that payment was 8 years old. 8 years of quietly shouldering every crisis, every emergency, every moment when the family needed help. 8 years of living under the illusion that they saw me, appreciated me, valued me. 8 years of thinking I was part of them. My throat tightened as another memory rose, one I hadn't thought about in years. A Christmas morning, when everyone else had opened gifts, and Dad had turned to me last with a soft, almost apologetic smile. I didn't have enough this year," he'd said, his voice low. I'd smiled back, pretending not to care, pretending I didn't notice the expensive necklace Patricia unwrapped, or the new laptop Mark received. Maybe Dad thought he was protecting me from disappointment. Maybe he didn't know the imbalance I already felt inside. But even then, even at 18, I had understood that my place in the hierarchy was different. Responsible, capable, self-sufficient to the point of invisibility. The truth wasn't new. It had simply been waiting for a moment loud enough to force me to hear it. The hotel room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as I clicked through the remaining files. My breath fogged the computer screen for a brief second before fading. There, amid all the financial records, sat a single email thread. The subject line was simple: re-funeral costs. The most recent message was from the funeral director confirming the $15,000 deposit funds I had sent, without hesitating. But the message below it, sent by Patricia, stilled every part of me. She had written, "We assume Emily has this covered. She always does." My hand went cold on the mouse. She didn't even ask. She assumed. Assumed the way someone assumes the sun will rise or the water will run from the tap. Something dependable. Something background. Something taken for granted. My pulse thudded in my ears as another realization sank in. The funeral home they booked, the one with the premium package, the custom flowers, the open bar reception, was one of my flagship locations. My own company. My own staff. My own brand. They were banning me from a service I paid for in a facility I owned. A slow heat began to gather behind my sternum. Not the painful sting of hurt that had followed me most of my life, but something clearer. Sharper. Like the first spark before a flame catches. I closed the laptop gently, the click of the hinge sounding final, almost ceremonial. The room felt different, quieter than before, as if waiting for me to decide who I would be from this point on. The air conditioner hummed, steady as a heartbeat. The truth was laid bare now. The years of being overlooked, used, minimized, every part of it had led to this moment. I could no longer pretend that silence kept the peace. Silence had only fed the illusion that I didn't mind being unseen. I stood, the carpet soft under my feet, and reached for my phone. The screen lit up, illuminating the room in pale blue. I scrolled to the contact list. My thumb hovered for only a moment. Then I tapped the number I needed. The number that would set everything in motion. Because it was time, past time, to confront the family who believed I was nothing more than a convenience. And they were about to learn exactly who I really was. The dining room fell silent the moment I rose from my chair, the scrape of wood against hardwood ringing far louder than it should have. Every face around the long oak table lifted toward me, Mark's fork suspended in midair, Jenna's hand frozen over her water glass, and Patricia's breath catching, as if she already sensed what was coming. I placed the thick envelope on the linen tablecloth, its corner brushing against a candle holder whose flame flickered with the sudden draft. "Before anyone takes another bite," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "there's something we need to talk about." I unfastened the clasp, and the papers spilled out across the white cloth like cards in a rigged deck. Hospital invoices, mortgage statements, tuition receipts, credit card redemptions, all of them stamped with the Morrison Memorial Services logo. Patricia's face drained of color. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly I heard the faint click of his teeth. And then I placed the final page on top, a printout of Patricia's email. "We assume Emily has this covered. She always does." The room stopped breathing. If you're wondering how everything came to a head like this, let me pull you back just a step, just enough to see the path that led me to this table tonight. After discovering the truth that night in the hotel, I understood there was no quiet way to fix this. I had spent years trying to hold my family together with gentle gestures and silent sacrifices. But silence had protected them, not me. And silence had created the illusion that their comfort came from thin air. So I printed every document, every payment, every instance of my company, covering the life they thought they were entitled to. The stack was heavier than I expected, a physical weight that seemed to echo the emotional one I'd carried for 8 years. I knew confronting them individually would only lead to deflection excuses, a dozen different versions of the same denial. No, this needed to happen in the open, with every voice in the room, with every witness present. So I waited until tonight, when the family gathered for the first meal after Dad's funeral. The dining room smelled faintly of rosemary chicken and lemon cleaner, the air warm from the oven and heavy with the kind of fragile calm that comes after grief but before truth. They sat close together, laughing too loudly, reaching for dishes, asking one another about travel plans and work. And every time they glanced in my direction, I saw the unease behind their eyes, like they were waiting to see if I'd remain in my proper place, quiet, dependable, invisible. I let them get comfortable, and then I stood. Now, as the papers lay exposed on the table, the stillness was almost tangible. The chandelier above us hummed faintly, its light sharp and unforgiving. Mark reached for one of the invoices, but hesitated before his fingers touched it. What is all this?" "You tell me," I said. "These are the bills you thought Dad's investments covered. The tuition you believed appeared out of nowhere. The credit card balances that magically reset every month." Jenna lifted one statement with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the total at the bottom. "Emily, this says you paid it." I nodded. Every single one. Patricia pressed her napkin to her mouth, the fabric trembling against her lips. "You didn't have to." "You're right," I cut in gently. "I didn't, but I did. For years. Without a word. Without a thank you. Without even the courtesy of a conversation." The room shifted then. That subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of the air, when the truth finally finds a crack in the walls people build around themselves. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. "Here's what I need you to understand," I said, resting my hand on the final document, one I hadn't shown yet. "The decisions you made without me about me weren't just careless. They were deliberate. Mark swallowed hard. We messed up, but we didn't mean I lifted the remaining page. Then what's this? I placed the paper in front of him, a photocopy of a funeral home authorization form, signed with my name. Except, I hadn't signed it. My actual signature curves upward slightly at the end. The one on the form sloped downward the way Mark's always did when he rushed through paperwork. The moment he saw it, his face blanched. "You used my name," I said quietly, "to authorize Dad's arrangements, without asking me, without even telling me he'd been hospitalized last month." Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Patricia's chair scraped backward. "Mark, tell me you didn't." He closed his eyes, shame washing over him like a shadow moving across his face. "We didn't have time. They needed a signature. And you always handle the bills. I thought you'd just take care of it." The room fell into a stunned, open-mouthed silence. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It wasn't just neglect or entitlement or years of being overlooked. It was forgery. It was a decision made behind my back, using my name, my company, my resources without my consent. I let the weight of it hang there, the quiet punctuated only by the faint clink of a dish settling as the table shifted. The smell of rosemary seemed suddenly too sharp, almost bitter. "Emily, I didn't think it was a big deal," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "Not a big deal," I repeated. "You signed my name to a legal document. You committed fraud. You put my business at risk. You put me at risk. And then you had the nerve to tell me I wasn't welcome at Dad's funeral." His shoulders sagged, as if the words had physically struck him. The others turned toward him now, not toward me. Patricia's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she said, "Mark, how could you?" Jenna shook her head slowly, disbelief clouding her features. "You told us Emily was being difficult, that she didn't want to help." And there it was, the second crack, the second lie, the twist that made everything slot into place. Mark exhaled shakily. I didn't want to look bad. I didn't want to tell you we needed Emily again, so I said she refused. I told Mom that Emily didn't care, that she didn't want to deal with Dad's bills anymore." Patricia covered her mouth, tears spilling between her fingers. "You said she didn't want to be part of the family. You said she was too busy with her business. You said she didn't think we mattered." I felt something soften inside me, not forgiveness, but a release. A strange, quiet exhale of finally seeing the truth as it was not as I feared. They hadn't pushed me out because I mattered too little. They had pushed me out because Mark lied, because Mark forged my name, because Mark let the family believe I abandoned them when he was the one tightening the distance inch by inch. Why, I asked, not angrily, just tired. He shook his head. "Because every time you step in, it makes me look small. It reminds me I can't hold things together the way you can, and instead of dealing with that, I made you the villain." A long breath moved through the room as if the house itself had been holding it for years. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, leaving the forged signature on top. "This ends tonight," I said. "No more secrets, no more lies, no more using my name. You look me in the eye from now on if you need something, and you own it." No one argued, no one excused, no one minimized. Mark whispered, What do we do now?" I stepped back from the table, the hardwood cool beneath my heels. "That's up to you," I said softly. "But I'm done being the one you hide behind. And with that, I turned toward the hallway. Behind me, the room remained frozen forks, untouched, glasses still full, faces pale in the chandelier's cold light. No one called after me. No one tried to stop me. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper as the truth settled across the table like a final, undeniable verdict. And then I walked out into the quiet, into the night, into the beginning of something entirely different. The night air felt almost too still as I stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind me with a soft thud that seemed to echo all the way through my ribs. The chatter from the dining room didn't follow me. It died the moment I walked out, leaving only the faint hum of the porch light and the rustle of cold wind moving through the bare branches overhead. I breathed in deeply, and for the first time in years, the air didn't feel borrowed. It felt like mine. My heels clicked against the concrete walkway as I moved toward my car, each step lighter than I expected, as if some invisible weight had been scraped off my shoulders. I paused at the driver's door, pressing my palm flat against the cold metal, grounding myself in the small, solid truth that the worst was finally over. Inside the house, the silence I left behind would settle like dust in sunlight, slow, unavoidable, revealing. But out here beneath the dark sky, something in me finally loosened. Something that had been knotted so tightly for so long, it felt like part of my spine. I didn't rush to drive away. I just stood there, letting the quiet seep in, letting the night wrap around me like a new beginning. Eventually, though, beginnings ask to be stepped into. I drove back to my home in Los Angeles the next morning, the early light spreading across the freeway in soft, muted shades of gold and gray. The flight had been quiet, the plane windows fogged with cold, and I spent most of the ride looking out at the slow shifting of clouds against the morning sky. Somewhere over the desert, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had been replaced by something steadier resolve maybe, or relief. When I unlocked my front door that afternoon, the familiar scent of cedar and the faint trace of jasmine from the candle I left on my desk welcomed me home. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in long, gentle stripes falling across the polished floors. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, tidy, calm mine. It felt like stepping back into myself. For the next week, I let life slow down. I cleared my calendar, turned off every notification that wasn't essential, woke up before dawn, and sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee watching the city shift from darkness to day. The sky changed color in quiet gradients, and I found myself breathing in time with it. Healing, I learned, can begin in silence. But healing also asks for action. And there were things, important things, I needed to reclaim. The first was my father's house. Not to keep, not to live in, but to settle properly. To honor him without the noise of our family's guilt or confusion. I drove back to Chicago for a weekend, the winter air sharp as glass. Inside the house, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted me. It still smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old books exactly as it had when I was a child. Dust coated the windowsills, soft winter light filtered through pale and gentle. I opened the windows anyway, letting the icy breeze sweep through the rooms. The cold felt cleansing. Necessary. I spent the day sorting through Dad's paperwork, his old leather wallet, the shoebox of letters he kept in the closet. I found a note he wrote years ago, never sent, thanking me for handling one of his medical bills. His handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but the message was unmistakable. He had known. He hadn't ignored me. He simply didn't know how to say it. I pressed the note to my chest and let the quiet hold me for a long moment. After settling the estate, I arranged for the house to be appraised and listed. Whatever came from the sale would be split evenly among the three of us, and I told my siblings that directly, calmly, without anger. It wasn't generosity, it was closure. A full circle. They didn't argue. They didn't try to negotiate. They simply nodded subdued understanding that fairness meant something different when it came from a place of strength. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance. Not coldly, not cruelly, just gently, the way you handle something fragile that needs room to heal on its own. When Mark called, his voice small with remorse, I listened. I didn't fix anything. I didn't reassure him. I just listened until he ran out of words. When Jenna texted asking how I was doing, I answered briefly but kindly. And Patricia, she wrote me a letter. A real letter. Apologizing in handwriting I barely recognized. I didn't respond, not right away. Some wounds don't close with a single gesture. Some need time, distance, and space to breathe. But I wasn't alone through any of this. My staff at the company stepped in with quiet support. An extra hand, with scheduling a warm cup of tea waiting at my desk, small kindnesses that didn't require explanation. One of my managers, Linda, stopped by my office one afternoon with a homemade casserole. "Thought you might be tired of takeout," she said, her voice gentle. Moments like that reminded me that family can grow in unexpected places, not from blood, but from presence, consistency, and sincerity. In their own way, they helped carry me through. By early spring, I felt ready, truly ready to move into the next chapter of my life. I bought a new home outside Los Angeles, a place surrounded by tall eucalyptus trees that sway like dancers when the wind moves through them. The house had a sunroom with floor-to-ceiling windows, and the first time I stepped inside, the late afternoon light washed over the walls in soft gold. It felt like stepping into warmth after a long winter. On moving day, I opened every window. Fresh air spilled into the rooms, carrying the scent of the garden's first blooms. I unpacked slowly, letting each object find its place, as if arranging pieces of myself that I had forgotten belonged together. Late in the afternoon, I planted a young lemon tree in the corner of the yard. The soil was cool beneath my palms, the roots delicate but determined. It felt like planting possibility. A future that was mine alone to grow. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. Mine. There are still moments, quiet ones, when a memory catches me off guard. The sound of Dad's laugh, the soft brush of a childhood bruise I hadn't realized I was still carrying. But those moments no longer pull me backward. They remind me how far I've come, how much I've rebuilt from the inside out. Sometimes healing arrives not with fanfare, but with the gentle settling of truth, with the door closing softly behind you, with the simple act of planting something new and watching it take root. And if there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's this. Sometimes you don't rebuild a life by reclaiming what was taken from you. You rebuild by choosing at minute to take up the space you were always meant to hold.